Today, we welcome to Global Citizenship Education interview series, Hans de Wit. Hans is Professor Emeritus and Distinguished Fellow and former Director of the Center for International Higher Education at Boston College in the US. Before, he was Director of the Center for Higher Education Internationalisation at the Università Cattolica Sacro Cuore in Milan and Professor of Internationalization of Higher Education at the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences, and Vice President for International Affairs of the University of Amsterdam. He's a Senior Fellow of the International Association of Universities, founding member and past President of the European Association for International Education, founding editor of the Journal of Studies in International Education, SAGE, consulting editor of the Journal Policy Reviews in Higher Education, and associate editor of International Higher Education. He has co-written books and articles on international education and is actively involved in consultancy for organizations like the European Commission, UNESCO, World Bank, IAU. So this is an excellent and diverse background, Hans. And first of all, I want to thank you for joining Global Citizenship Education interview series today. It's a pleasure to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be there and looking forward to our conversation.
So in preparing for this video interview, I read several of your publications, and I'd like to start by quoting a short extract from your recent article, Internationalization of Higher Education in a Post-Pandemic World, Challenges and Responses, where you say with colleagues, of course, that 2 years into the global COVID-19 pandemic, there is little doubt that its effects on higher education are significant. The impacts are both broad and profound, and the pandemic has disrupted and reshuffled not just activities related to internationalization, for example, mobility and cooperation, but also activities related to the core mission of higher education, for example, teaching, research, and service to society. And so in this context, I want to begin our conversation with a straightforward question, which is, what does internationalization mean? Why is it important? And how does it relate to the concept of global citizenship?
Well, thank you for that question. It's a very broad question and not easy to answer in a short essence. But of course, internationalization is a very broad umbrella concept. It addresses many different issues depending on the context in where it is happening, which is quite different by regions, by countries, by institutions. It's quite different if you look over time. So it is an evolving process. It changes to developments in national, regional, and international context. And so it is, in my view, a process that constantly adapts itself to circumstances and context in which it's operating. That means that, and there is a long history about the evolution of the definition of what is internationalization, that also changes and is adapted by people to their specific context all the time.
Right. So a dynamic concept.
It's a very dynamic concept, and it is indeed context related. When we saw in the 1990s, when in particular Jay Knight from that time, Ryerson in Canada, and I were working with the OECD and some other partners in Australia and in Europe and the United States about trying to understand what we meant with internationalization of higher education. It was the first time that we looked at it as a process. Before that, internationalization even was not mentioned as such. It was more used the term international education, which was a whole list of activities. But we said that it is increasingly has to be perceived as a process that involves the different functions of the university. It involves the different ways how we disseminate that process in international context, etc. So we respond to globalization processes. We are looking into how higher education can be an actor in that globalization process. And so we had to react to that. It was done mostly from a very practitioner point of view. We were involved as directors of international affairs, and we looked into try to understand what is our working meaning. And in the 1990s, that was still, and certainly in the beginning of the 1990s, it was still in a very positive way. The world was, the Cold War had finished, the European programs were emerging, and there was much more a kind of democratic approach to the world. So everything was very positive. So internationalization was perceived as being contributing to the good and making people much more aware how they are perceived to be global citizens. That was another term that emerged around that time much more clearly. It existed before, but it became much more of a kind of also concept. Global citizenship and internationalization, by that, are very interconnected. They are basically saying we prepare students, faculty, people to become much more interconnected to the global world. And we have to educate that. So internationalization and global citizenship education, in my view, are more or less in the same arena. And of course, the global citizenship education concept has been much more focused on what we call the internationalization at home, or internationalization of the curriculum part of the internationalization process, not so much directed to the more market-oriented mobility focus of internationalization, but at the same time, also being mobile can create some kind of global citizenship development. So for me, the two are very much connected, and the two are also context related and evolving, constantly evolving, developing on context as we are. And has that emerged more during the recent years as a result of the pandemic? Yes, but at the same time, all the issues that we have to be addressing with respect to global citizenship education and internationalization were already in debate before the pandemic. So the pandemic basically gave a moment of reflecting on what we are doing. And then we have to see, can we go back to the old times, which was much more a kind of neoliberal approach to internationalization and global citizenship education, or can we move it into much more direction of addressing the big issues of sustainable development goals, health, poverty, climate, and how can we address that in a completely changed geopolitical environment that we are today? So that is a little bit of context about how I look at internationalization and global citizenship education.
So, as you know, there is a lot of discussion about several approaches to global citizenship and internationalization as well, as you just mentioned, more neoliberal or perhaps more critical and ethically oriented. So how do you see this contrast? How do you frame it? How do you discuss it in terms of the type of values and knowledge that the global citizenship education within the context of the whole discussion on internationalization should promote? What type of knowledge and values do you see as core within the context of the post-COVID-19 pandemic, environmental issues, perhaps even lack of dialogue between us as human beings, lack of relationship with our environment, non-humans? I write a lot about this in my publications too. So how do you frame this sort of a contrast between theoretical approaches to global citizenship?
Well, I think what we started already in the, as I mentioned before, in the 1990s, seeing internationalization as a kind of neutral process. So everything which was international in education, everything was also global citizenship education, was seen as something that happens. And we have to address the importance of it and the challenge of it, but it was seen as a kind of natural process that would happen anyway. That was a little bit naive, because we saw that indeed the neoliberal approach in the second half of the 1990s, and in particular after the turn of the century, have become much more important in the way we look at internationalization. Seen as a kind of revenue source, seen as a kind of political environment of soft power and knowledge diplomacy, and not seeing as something which was based on the values which would be inherent to a kind of much more normative approach to internationalization and global citizenship education is we have to do it because it's important that we prepare our students for a world which is much more interconnected, but also has to challenge the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. So we had to move away from a much more neutral approach to internationalization and global citizenship education to a much more normative approach based on ethics and values that we had to define, which is something which is much more subjective on the one hand, and is countering the stream of internationalization as a much more neoliberal market-oriented approach. But I think it was essential to make that shift given the world we are living in today. We really have to be much more activist in that sense. We have to address issues like neocolonialism. Internationalization and global citizenship education has been perceived much more as a kind of Western paradigm, which we impose on the developing world. And that's something we also have to be aware of. And we, particularly my work with Elspeth Jones, we had already 15 years ago said that it's important that we have to address those issues. And you see now that there's a whole kind of new way of thinking, of focusing much more of inclusion and equity by scholars from, in particular, the Global South, that are addressing those issues in a different way than we have been doing before. So again, it has been an evolving process, an evolution of thinking about internationalization, that we have to be aware that as Western scholars have not to think that we can say what we mean with global citizenship education, what we mean with internationalization. Also have to listen to what are the meanings of that process in the Global South, and how have we to accommodate with those kind of meanings and different perceptions of internationalization and global citizenship education.
And that's very interesting that you perceive internationalization and global citizenship education from this perspective. And in relation to this point, you mentioned that we need a more activist approach, a more ethically oriented and critically oriented approach. I want to ask you a second question, and this is usually a very interesting part of these dialogues. As an educator, how has internationalization and global citizenship played a role in your journey as an educator, researcher, but also really as a human being?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think for me, internationalization has been part of my my genes for more than 50 years. I mean, as a student, I studied social anthropology and sociology of development, and I had my study abroad experience for my master's degree in Peru, in Latin America, so it has been always part of my life. And then I started to work in international relations at the Dutch University in Tilburg, and I started to wonder, well, I'm doing this, but why are we doing this? And what are we doing? How are we doing things? What is the impact of what we're doing? So I started to not only work from a practical point of view, but also thinking about it much more theoretically, to see, well, can I explain for myself that the work that I'm doing has meaning and understanding? And so it has impacted me in my professional life, but it has also impacted me enormously in my private life, because I mean, by being so much interconnected, I have to get to know a large part of the world. I have friends all over the world and colleagues all over the world which I work with, and that has created enormous value for my personal development and my academic development. So it has been important and continues to be important, although I'm now retiring. I'm still trying to keep much more reflecting on the work that I've been doing, and at the same time, I keep as much as possible contact with my friends all over the world. So yeah, it has been enormously impacted my personal life and my professional and academic life.
Right. Is there any particular moments of your journey of life, either a private moment or a teaching moment or a research moment where you that you like to share with our audience that particularly relates to the importance of the notion of internationalization and global citizenship? Any short but significant experience you like to share?
Well, the point is it's difficult to choose what is emotional. But I think people perceive me as that I have been always at the forefront of thinking about internationalization of higher education. But at the same time, I always have listened very carefully to what others say. So I have been very much influenced by people like Betty Lisk and Elspeth Jones, my colleagues Jos Belen and others about the importance of internationalization of the curriculum as an important part of internationalization, more than the whole focus on mobility, for instance. I've been influenced by my work with Philip Albach over the past 25 years about how internationalization is context related to what is happening in higher education in general, that it is not isolated from the development of international higher education. I've been influenced, of course, by Jay Knight, my work with Jay Knight in the 1990s about, I think, so there have been so many influences that have changed me and my thinking, and by that I could also make the process thinking. So I see myself much more as a stimulator than as an inventor. Take the example of collaborative online international learning, COIL, which is a development which started in the United States and by people like John Rubin. And I was invited at a conference where I for the first time heard about, I mean, of course, I knew about virtual exchange, virtual mobility, etc., but that I heard about COIL. And I wrote on that an article in University World News where I advocated COIL as a kind of alternative way of looking at internationalization of the curriculum and combining it with the mobility and as a virtual exam. And that stimulated enormously, as people like John Rubin has confirmed, the discussion about COIL. So it was not that I invented COIL, but I gave it a platform to develop itself as an alternative way of thinking. And that, I think, has been my role in particular, to help stimulating things and looking at things in a different way. And that's what I try also now. I think internationalization is still a very vague and sloppy process of all kind of words like internationalization and mobility, etc., without really understand people being clear about what they mean. So I'm also now much more critically reflecting on that because I have those kind of influences that have changed me, and I've seen the positive but also the dangerous impacts of those kind of developments. And so that's what I see as my role in particular for the future, to try to
a critical stimulator.
Critical stimulator, exactly. Yeah.
We should write a piece about this. Okay, so this is very interesting, and I want to move on with the third question for our conversation today. I'd like to discuss with you 2 or 3 coming up projects or recent projects that you believe are particularly interesting for our audience and or particularly interesting to you and that you are particularly focusing on at this point in time.
Yeah, it relates to what I said just before. It's about reflecting. I'm working now at 2 book projects, one with Betty Lisk and Elspeth Jones, where we, for Edward Elgar, try to write a book in understanding internationalization. And that's where we try to create a kind of handbook about what do we mean with internationalization and the different dimensions of internationalization, and critically reflecting on it, but also making it a kind of tool for people who are students who are working on global citizenship education development, practitioners, university leaders, to understand better what we mean.
Right.
And that's something I always wanted to have to do, and to some extent I have done it in the past, but now I want to do it in a very structural, simple way. This is what's going to happen. And similarly, I'm working with Philip Albach and Tessa de Leguil, one of my PhD graduates, in a similar kind of book about international higher education. So what are the key concepts of international higher education? So in that sense, I want to provide the community with two books that are really can be used as a kind of reflection on the key ideas about internationalization, global citizenship education, etc., and how that fits into the context of international education. That are my two big projects. In addition to that, I continue to work on certain specific aspects. We are also editing a book on corruption in higher education, because we also have to look at the negative sides of higher education, and how that impacts and how can we address that. I continue to work on my several journals that I am as an advisor on. So that has always been part of my life, is to reflect on what's happening. So not planning ahead, these are the big research topics, but looking into what is happening and then working on that, like the work that we did on refugees and higher education. The work that we have been doing about, partly influenced by my work at Boston College, about what does internationalization mean in Catholic higher education around the world. And that was responding to context and looking into that. So that's my main agenda. But besides that, those two big projects, book projects, are very important for me as a kind of closure of my contribution to the international higher education community.
Excellent. I'd like to conclude our dialogue, a conversation, with a challenging question. And the question is, could you define internationalization and global citizenship education using just three keywords, and why these three keywords?
Yeah, I've thought about that, and of course, defining I find difficult these days, because I'm more critical about definitions than ever before, and I think we have to look into what does is it so important to have definitions. I think it's much more important that we look at the key questions of why and what, how, and the impact it has in different contexts. So, but for me, key points for the future of internationalization is, how does it impact society? So service to society is very important for me. Inclusion and equity are also very important dimensions of internationalization. And in essence, that applies to global citizenship education as well. I mean, global citizenship education has two components. You have to prepare students to be a global professional. So what does it mean for your work? How can you connect to that? But then the citizenship part is much more the service to society. And I think that has become increasingly more important as we look into global citizenship education. How can we prepare students to be prepared to service to the societal needs that we have in these very challenging days? So also there, service to society, inclusion, equity are very important parts of global citizenship education. So there is, again, no difference between the two. They all have to emphasize that.
So we have serving society, or serving and supporting the common good, inclusion and equity as three key words. Let's call it like this, rather than definitions.
Yeah.
All right.
Excellent.
Thank you very much, Hans. This was a very interesting conversation. We discussed very interesting aspects of your work, and I'm confident that our audience will benefit from your interesting thoughts today. Thank you.
Thank you, and also for the great work that you are doing, not only with this presentation, the discussions, but also with your academic work. So congratulations on that as well.
Thank you. I will treasure your words. Thank you, Hans.